Hello everyone! Welcome to another Planetarium live stream. My name is Patrick Hess. I'm your Planetarium specialist. So excited to have you join us. If you're coming back and you've seen our streams already, welcome back. And if this is your first time, welcome. I hope you enjoy our show today. We've got a special show planned for today. Things are going to be a little different than what we've been doing so far. But before we start, I just wanted to give you all a little rundown. If you don't know what our schedule is like, we are streaming live on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. At 6 p.m. every day. Our schedule is that on Mondays we do a live tour of the night sky. It's our What's Up stream for the week where I show you different stars and constellations you can see in our night skies for the week. Wednesday is our special deep dive live stream where we dive into astronomy topics like probes and rovers, the solar system, deep space objects, all sorts of things like that. And then Friday is our stream where we answer your questions. It's Fan Friday, and you can throw in questions in our comment section wherever you're watching, whether it's the Union Station page or the Planetarium page or Science City. Feel free to drop your comments there. You can drop your comments in the comment section on Mondays and Wednesdays as well. We just may not have as much time to answer all those questions, but we write them all down and we answer them on Friday for sure. So if we miss your question today or we missed it on Monday, be sure to tune in on Friday and you'll hear the answer to that question then. A couple other little housekeeping things. I wanted to mention that we've got a auction for Giving Tuesday that's still going on. The links to that are on all the Facebook pages, and there is actually a special Planetarium auction piece that you can bid for, and that is for a private showing at the Gottlieb Planetarium for you and 14 guests. And you can see that we have started the bidding on that, and there are a lot of other auction items you can check out, all with exclusive benefits at Union Station and Science City. So be sure to head over to the Union Station Facebook page or the Planetarium page where you'll find links to these auctions. And remember, all these proceeds benefit a Union Station and all the programs that we're bringing you, like this show right now. So. Now, we're just going to jump right in because today, like I said, is a special show. And today we are going to be talking about telescopes. And I know you guys have been looking forward to this stream. I've been talking about it for a couple weeks. And we've already got some people jumping in the comments. Looks like Lindy's been looking forward to this tonight. So hope you enjoy the show, Lindy. And Melissa's son also just got a new telescope. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit about telescopes today. So let's talk about telescopes now. Let's talk about different types of telescopes. I won't spend too much time here because, as promised, we are going to be setting up a telescope today, but I just wanted to give you all a primer about telescopes so we can have a framework to work with as we are going. I also just wanted to mention that we are having this is a special stream, like I said, and we may see a cameo from my pet bird. So just a little heads up that there may be a bird flying into the scene. I know some people have different feelings about birds, but just wanted to give all of our watchers a fair warning on that one. So let's talk about telescopes. Now, there are three main types of telescopes or categories of telescopes we could think of. And it's pretty simple, and they're split up based on how they bend and focus light. There's a reflector, there's a refractor, those are the two most common, and then there are compound telescopes. Reflecting telescopes primarily use a mirror, a concave mirror, shaped sort of like a bowl, and as light enters the telescope tube, it bounces off that concave mirror, and the mirror is what focuses the light into a small point, where it bounces off a second mirror into your eyepiece. And that mirror is responsible for focusing that light, and the wider the aperture, the more light your telescope takes in and the clearer the image. And these telescopes, you look in at the top here, as you can see the light bounces off two mirrors. So that is the really easiest way to tell this type of telescope. A refracting telescope uses lenses to bend and focus light, and you can see there are a series of lenses here that focus the light. Then there's a mirror at the bottom that will send the light into your eyepiece as well. Sometimes the light will just go straight into the eyepiece. Telescopes that you've seen pirates use are refracting telescopes. You look in the bottom of those, and that's an easy way to tell. And then the third category, there are compound telescopes that use a combination of lenses and mirrors. A common one you may have heard of is a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, but that is another type that just uses combinations. And there are a variety of telescopes that fit into that category. But the most common ones are reflectors and refractors. And both these telescopes are decent telescopes to start out with if you're looking on getting a telescope. I often recommend reflectors because in my opinion, they're a little bit easier to maintain and transport. They're a lot lighter since they are mostly hollow. And we'll see my telescope is a reflector telescope. Now there is another thing that differentiates telescopes, and that is the mount. So you can have a tube like this, whether it's a reflector or refractor, and you can combine it with a different variety of mounts. So the other category, the other differentiator between telescopes is the mount. And there are really two main types of telescope mounts. And that is an altitude azimuth mount and an equatorial mount. This Dobsonian is just an altitude azimuth mount that's basically on the ground, but they both work in the same principle. Basically, to point it at an object, you point it left and right, and then up and down to find that object. And these are really easy to use. These types of mounts are common in camera equipment as well. If you have a digital camera or a fancy camera with a tripod, that mount is probably an altitude azimuth mount, where you just move it left to right and up and down to point it at whatever you want to look at. So they are easier to point at things, but the disadvantage is that they do not track. So the problem is, as we've seen in our star tours, stars don't stay in the same place all night, and that goes for planets and the moon and everything in the night sky, because the Earth is constantly rotating. In an altitude azimuth mount, when you point it at something, it'll look at that object, but depending on how far away that object is and how zoomed in you are, that object will move out of your field of view, and you'll have to find it all over again. So to solve this problem, an equatorial mount was invented, and this mount has a different axes, and it is aligned with the North Star. As we saw before in our star tours, the night sky will rotate around the North Star. And if we can track the things in the sky based on that axis, we can track objects in the sky. And I'll explain that a little bit more when we dive into our telescope, because the mount I'll be using is an equatorial mount. I recommend them for most astronomy, because although it may take a little bit extra work to find an object in the sky, once you find it, it's a lot easier to track. And like I said, a lot of these objects will tend to move throughout the evening. So without further ado, we are going to jump into the other portion of our live stream today. I am going to finally escape from this pocket dimension that I've been living in, and you will finally see, well, the outside of this pocket dimension. And let's cross our fingers that my camera setup is going to work. So we are going to, I'm going to do some magical switching here, and we're going to switch our view to this camera. Hopefully you all can still see me, and maybe my helpers online will just give me a heads up to make sure that this is all still working, but it looks like from my view that it is working. So welcome to my apartment. So let's go ahead and begin with our telescope. And my bird is already saying hello. And once again, she may fly into the frame, so just to let you all know that could happen. All right, I'm getting the all good, so we are going to go ahead and start. So I've got my telescope, and it is in two parts here. We've got two separate bags, basically. Now, telescopes that you may purchase, they may be smaller, they may be transportable in one container, but mine, its parts are a little heavier, so I've separated them into two sections. So, like I said, we will be setting up an equatorial mount with a reflecting tube. And this always starts with a tripod. So I'm going to take my tripod out. Now, oftentimes when you buy a telescope and when you store a telescope, the tripod will be all by itself. So it might look a little like this, and oftentimes we'll have something dangling down here. We'll use this in a second. But the first thing I want you all to notice about this tripod, and this will go for most telescope tripods for mounts, is that on the top of it, there is a little N, okay? Now, it might not say N on your telescope, but there should be something to mark out one corner of the tripod that is supposed to go north. So in this case, I've got another little sort of nub that sticks up here, and that tells me that is north. So we're going to want to orient this mount towards the north. And remember, this is because an equatorial mount is designed to follow the North Star. It's designed to be aligned to the North Star, and in case you didn't hear, the North Star is towards the north. So I'm going to point this towards the north. Now, I know where north is because that's how my apartment is oriented, but obviously if you're out in the woods or in a observing spot, you may not know where north is, so I would recommend having a compass with you. Most smartphones have a compass app built into them, so you can use that. And this doesn't have to be exact, and chances are you won't be able to get it exact anyway because telescope mounts are often metallic, made of metal, so they might affect your compass. But if you can get it close, that's fine. We'll dial in all the other stuff later. So I'm going to get this pointing mostly north, okay? And in fact, I'm going to put it over here, set more center to the view. There we go. All right. So I've got it pointing north. Now another thing we're going to want to do eventually is to level our telescope, but we don't have to do this right away. First, I'm going to attach the mount itself to the tripod. For smaller mounts, your mount you may just leave it attached to your tripod, and that's fine, but mine is designed to come apart because the tripod is heavy and the mount is heavy. But most beginner telescopes will probably be a lot lighter, so you won't have to worry about that. So here is my equatorial mount, and this is a beefy guy. This particular one is an Orion Skyview Pro. I'm not endorsing Orion, they didn't pay for any sponsorship or anything, but this is what I am using. Now, on the bottom here, you'll see a point that it'll attach to our mount, and then you'll also notice that I'll need to line this up to where north is, right? Now, I'm familiar with this mount, so I know this direction is supposed to be north, but your mount should be designed so it only will fit onto your tripod by facing north. So we're gonna pop it on here. Now this will kind of just sit here, but this is the most valuable part of your telescope mount. So we don't want it to just be kind of wobbling here. We obviously want to attach it to the rest of our tripod. And that's what this bar down here is for. So mine actually screws the tripod into the mount. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So our mount here is firmly attached to the tripod and won't fall over or get hurt or anything. There we go. All right. So now that that is firmly attached, we are ready to attach the bracket that will support the tripod. And again, your telescope may be slightly different and it may have a different setup for this, but most telescope tripods will have some sort of bracket or tray. Mine is designed to actually hold eyepieces, which is really nifty. But it also is designed, its purpose is to keep your mount's legs stable and keep them firmly apart and firmly where they are. So we're going to go ahead and attach that and make sure I don't lose this washer. I once lost this washer on the roof of a barn. That's a fun story. Yeah, so I've been telescoping in a lot of different places. All right, so we're going to tighten that. We don't have to tighten it too much though, because this is metal on metal. All you really need is friction to hold the legs in place. Another thing I do, especially if I'm on like grass or dirt or a non-solid surface, is I'll make sure to kind of pick up each leg one at a time and just make sure they're all spread out, because I might have not put the legs all the way out. And if I tighten this up, it might not be firmly stable. So I'm just kind of pulling outwards on the legs and tightening this, and not making it super tight, but just enough that this metal part is pushing onto these legs, and now this whole thing is very stable and sturdy, and it's going to stay still. Now, if you're on a grassy or dirty surface, you want to make sure your tripod is firmly in the ground. The legs of the tripod are all the way down, because now we're going to level our tripod. And I usually use a smartphone app, because there's a level built into iPhones, which I don't have right now, because my phone is being used as this camera. So what I'll do is I'll set my phone on here, or if you have another surface level or something like that, you can do that. We're not going to be actually stargazing right now, so I'm not going to worry about that, but I just want to point out that at this point, we are going to level our mounts, and we're going to make sure that the whole thing is nice and level, and that's going to be very important for the rest of the way that our equatorial mount tracks, okay? We need to make sure it is very, very level. And again, we pointed it mostly north, but we'll be adjusting the fine points of that a little bit later. Okay, so now that that's in, what I'm going to do for my telescope here is I'm going to put on the counterweights. Now, equatorial mounts work based on counterbalance. So on one side of your telescope mount is going to be the tube, which will be pretty heavy. And so there needs to be a balancing mechanism on the other side to keep it from pulling in one direction, because the way this whole thing works is that it has to be perfectly pointed at, or it has to be perfectly balanced so that you can track things in the sky. And again, this all makes sense as we continue on. But I'm going to go ahead and attach my counterweights. Now, depending on the size of your mount, you may leave your counterweights on, and that's fine, but my counterweights are pretty heavy. So I always take them out and I store them separately. in this foam thing that's falling apart. There we go. All right, so mine are pretty heavy, and I'm going to put these in first just because I don't want to put my telescope tube with the delicate optics on without some sort of counterweight to hold it on. Otherwise the whole thing might tip over. So we're going to go ahead and attach these, and in my case they just screw on here. I could take the weights off, but I've kind of gotten a system for screwing this in while keeping the weights on. And we will be balancing it later, so we don't have to worry too much about where exactly the weights are. We'll be adjusting that. So I'm just going to tighten these weights somewhere on this bar here. And in my case, I have this second thread to kind of hold it on with friction. So there it goes. Don't worry, your telescope probably came with instructions, and if it doesn't, I'm sure we can find them online. Because a lot of these things will differ slightly. But again, if you have an equatorial mount, the process will be basically similar, and all the pieces will still be there. All right, so we have our mount ready for our tube. And my tube lives in this bag where the tripod was, so we can go ahead and take it out. So here is my telescope tube. This is a 6-inch reflector. It is Orion as well. Now this tube I actually got with a separate mount. So that's another nice thing about telescopes, is that you can start with one tube and one mount, and you can upgrade the tube and keep the old mount, or you can upgrade the mount and keep the old tube, and you can kind of upgrade it piecemeal like that. This bracket is removable, as you can see. So I can switch this tube out for a different tube, or get a different bracket and attach it to this mount. And different mounts are rated for different weights. So this is sort of a middle weight. I could probably get away with like an 8-inch reflector on this same mount based on its weight. Because remember, the counterweight has to be able to counterbalance. But this is a reflecting telescope, right? So on the bottom is a mirror, and on the top, well, it's just open actually, and I can take the top off, and I can show you that mirror right in there. So the thing is mostly hollow, fairly light, but that mirror is delicate, and we want to keep the tube cap on here to make sure no dust or anything falls into it. And another important thing to consider is that this mirror is precisely aligned. There are screws on the bottom here that are actually alignment screws. So these alignment, sorry, I keep cutting my head off. You'd think my grandmother was taking my picture. So these alignment screws are easily messed up. So it's not extremely difficult to realign your telescope optics. That's called collimating, and instructions can be found online, but it's something you don't want to have to do very often. So you definitely never want to set your telescope down on the ground like this, especially a reflecting telescope, and you never want to really hold the bottom of it. So I always hold mine under my arm, or I hold onto this bracket here. And then the eyepiece, again, remember, at the top of the telescope is where we'll be looking through. And I'll mention a little bit about challenges and difficulties that causes. But so this rail here will actually fit onto my mount. And most telescope mounts will have a couple set screws that will hold this rail on. The way I always do it is I put it on this rail right in the center, and then I just kind of support it, you know, with one arm while I tighten the set screw here. And then I have a second safety screw, so that just screws on right there. So now it is slotted in, and we've got most of the telescope assembled. Now there are a couple other things I'm going to add, because the next step is going to be balancing, and we want to make sure that most of the weight we are going to have on our telescope is already on before we balance it out, because if we put something really heavy on it after we balance it, it's not going to be balanced anymore. So one thing I will add is a spotting scope. So most telescopes have a second, tinier scope that will help you find things in the sky. If you were trying to find, say, a planet through this telescope, and you were looking straight through the eyepiece and you were super zoomed in, it'd be really hard to find something, because you're so zoomed in, you're only looking at a tiny part of the sky, and it'd be really hard to sort of find that thing. So a spotting scope is sort of a middle step. This is sort of has the magnification power of binoculars, and you use this to point at what you're wanting to look at before you look into the main the main sort of zoomed part of the telescope, if that makes sense. And now many are constructed similarly. So mine, the small end actually goes in the wider side of this. I'll have to crouch down a little bit. And there is a little spring-loaded little set thing here that I kind of pull out, and then it'll actually kind of click in to a certain spot. sorry, I did this wrong. I did this backwards. So the small end is going to go into the small end of this this guy here, which is I got the counterintuitive part wrong. So we're going to pull this little silver guy out. It's springed out, and that's going to pop in, and there's a little sort of rail for that to pop in. Now the other thing is I've got these two smaller set screws that are alignment screws. So we are going to have to align our spotting scope, and I'll walk you through that in a minute. But for now, we're just going to leave those alone. And if we want, I can take my lens caps off of this one. I always store my lens caps inside of my container where the main part lives. That way I don't lose them. So I would recommend using that practice. This, by the way, is just a Pelican case that I've plucked out the pieces for myself. And I'd recommend getting something like this to organize all of your stuff, because there are a lot of smaller parts that are easily lost in a bag. All right, so our spotting scope is on this little holder, and this holder has a set of rails as well. And these rails go on the top of the tube here, and there's a little set screw, so I'm going to loosen that up. I'm going to slide that in, and I can actually, let me angle this a little bit so it's easier to see. And I'll talk about what I just did in a minute. But so that is going to slot in, so it's going to go into this rail, and then we're going to tighten it up. Just realized that I haven't checked the comments. Let me see if we had any questions come up so far. Tammy's asking how much telescopes usually cost, and that can vary. You can get a great beginner telescope for around $100. That's a great start that you'll be able to see the rings of Saturn with. Obviously, you can spend a lot more than that, but like I said, the great thing about telescopes is that they are often modular, and you can start with maybe a nicer tube and a cheaper mount, and then upgrade to a better mount later on while keeping your tube. All right, so what we were doing is we were putting things on to kind of add weight to our telescope. So I'm going to add a eyepiece as well. And let me see, you know what, we're going to try something here. So I'm going to switch here. Hopefully you guys, it seems like you can still hear me. I think I don't have to talk quite as loud. So let me just show you up close what I was doing to put this, this spotting scope on. So here's that rail I was talking about. So it slots right in there, and it falls out unless you tighten this little screw here. So we're going to tighten that up. All right. So next to the spotting scope, oh, there's my bird. Next to the spotting scope is the eyepiece holder right here. So there's a cap on this, and I'm going to loosen these set screws and take this cap off. And this we definitely don't want to lose, so I'm just going to store this in the main pocket of the case here. All right, so now our telescope is kind of open, so we can actually see the secondary mirror. And if I take this light off, you can actually see it there. And we can see through the secondary mirror the primary mirror, which is the one at the bottom of the telescope. And then now it's just looking at my ceiling. So I'm going to put an eyepiece in there. And I've got a couple different eyepieces. I've got a big one here that is, how many, 40 millimeters. Got a slightly smaller one that's 17 millimeters. I've got a 10 millimeter, and I've got a 6.3 millimeter. Now, this is another counterintuitive thing. The bigger the eyepiece, or the wider the lens on the eyepiece, the less zoomed it is. So if we want to get super zoomed in, we would pick a smaller eyepiece, if that makes sense. Now, the problem is, so this number, remember I'm going to store my lens caps in there, this number references the size of the optics there. So you can see this 40 millimeter eyepiece has a really wide field of view, but the 6 millimeter eyepiece has a super tiny field of view. So while we could zoom in with the 6 millimeter eyepiece, it will be a little tricky to actually use that eyepiece because that aperture is so small. And I'll talk a little bit about different sort of non-standard eyepieces later after we finish setting this up, but I'm just going to pick a relatively heavy one, and that slots right into the eyepiece slot here. Ooh, we've got some recursion on the screen. And this is just loose, so we're going to tighten these set screws. Now this is metal on metal, so you don't have to tighten this very hard, just enough so that there's friction that this doesn't fall out, because this might be inverted and kind of pointing upside down. All right, so let's return to, there we go. Okay, so back to our wide angle here. All right, so I've got most of the weight on the telescope, and now it's time to balance it. So this equatorial mount has a couple levers on it that you can see on this side that lock the axes in place. Now there are two axes, two different axes, you get what I'm saying, on equatorial mounts. There's the right ascension and the declination axis. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the astrophysics of what those two things mean specifically, but suffice it to say that they correlate relatively with latitude and longitude, essentially. But right now they're locked in place, which we wanted them locked while we were setting this up. So if I unlock them, now yours may have sort of screw type things, mine has levers, so I'm going to unlock them. And now the axes are loose, and I can actually move it freely. And so, as you can see, this mount kind of moves weirdly, right? It doesn't move exactly how you would imagine like a tripod for a camera would move. And that makes it sometimes tricky to find things in the sky. But again, the point of this is that it's aligned with the North Star. In fact, after we set this up, the North Star should be, or when the telescope is sort of zeroed out, sort of in its default position, it should be pointing right at the North Star. And there's a way we can align that, which I'll show you in a minute. But first, we want to balance the telescope out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on its side so that it's parallel with the ground, so the mount is parallel with the ground and the tube is parallel with the ground here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let it go lightly. And I can see that it is not balanced. It seems very top heavy. This side wants to go down if I just let go. So what I want to do is I want this part of the tube to slide down a little bit. Now in my case, my tube mount has these little screws here that I can actually slide the tube around. And you saw me do that earlier when I rotated it. So what I'll do is I'll loosen that a little bit. We don't want to loosen it too much. There's felt inside here that's causing friction holding this in, and we don't want to loosen it all the way so that this bracket falls off. But we're going to loosen it enough that we'll be able to slide it. And so I'm going to slide it back a little bit to try to balance it out. Oh, now there's too much weight on the back end. So we're going to slide it the other way. Okay, so it feels like we're pretty good. So I can tighten that back up. And since this is felt friction, we don't want to tighten this too much because we don't want to squeeze the tube. Just enough that they're sort of hand tight so that this doesn't slide up and down. All right, so we can turn it back this way and I can test to make sure. All right, great. So if I kind of just do light taps, make sure that gravity's not wanting to pull it one way or the other, it's pretty balanced on that end. We also want to balance it on this axis. And right now it is pretty balanced, but just to show you what it would be like if it wasn't balanced, if these weights I had put too far on one side here, you would see that they would tend to pull down, and then that would pull the other side up. So we would want to move these along this bar here to a point where the whole assembly is balanced. All right, so it feels pretty balanced. And again, I'm just kind of giving it light taps, and it should stop after not too long, and it should kind of go the same distance based on the same force. So this takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of, but it's very important for the rest of our mount to work, and especially in cases where our mount is motorized, which mine is, and I'll get to that in a minute. That is very important as well. But it's pretty balanced, so we can move it back up here, and it should feel effortlessly to move around when it's balanced, because that counterweight is making the center of gravity right in the center of the mount. So it should be really easy to move around, and you should be able to do it with just one finger, no matter how heavy your telescope is. So we're going to return it back to its default position. Now, my telescope is extra fancy, and this probably won't be the case for yours, but the next step will be to north align our telescope. Now, in your case, most likely the way you'll do that is by using some set screws in your mount to kind of do some fine point adjustments. So what we'll do, assuming you have a mount like that, is we will zero our telescope, so we'll make sure it's nice and centered, and then I'm going to lock those levers again so that it's not moving freely anymore. And then what you would do is you would get very zoomed out on your eyepiece, so you get a very wide eyepiece, and then you would find the North Star, which should be visible. Don't forget to take your tube cap off as well. And then what you'll do is you'll use these set screws. Now I've got two little screws here, and basically what happens when I turn those screws is it turns the telescope very, very slightly to the east and west. So I can show you that over here. So once again, these little set screws here, what you can see is that they're both screwed tight here. So if I loosen one side and then tighten the other, it's going to very slightly move my mount in one direction. So I can loosen that one, tighten the other, I can loosen this one, tighten the other, and you can see it moving just so slightly. And that is north aligning it. Okay, so we got it close to north, and then you use this to get it precisely north, as precisely as you can. There's a margin of error here, and if you get it pretty close, you'll still have success with your telescope. So don't worry too much about that process. Now I said mine's a little fancy because we have one telescope, the main tube. We have a second telescope, the spotting scope, and we also have a third telescope that is actually hiding inside of my mount. So there's actually a telescope inside this mount, and this telescope is used to north align my telescope. And to do that, it's pretty cool actually. And I'll just show that as well. So, like I said, there is a hollow spot inside my mount, and there's actually a telescope hiding inside of it. So what we'll do is what we do to align mine is that I actually loosen my declension axis, and then as I rotate my tube here, it actually opens up this scope like that. And I'm going to lock it in place there. And what I do to polar align, we call it polar alignment. What I do to north align my telescope, or polar align it, is actually look through this, and if you see it in here, you can actually see that inside the spotting scope, there's a little star chart, and it has Cassiopeia and the Big Dipper, and it has Polaris on a circle with a cross in the center. Now, all right, I knew that was going to happen. Give me 1 second. We are going to return our secondary camera feed in just a moment. Okay, hooray, we're back. Everybody say hi to Helen. She's very not interested in what we're doing. All right, so we're back. As I was saying, inside of our spotting scope here is this little grid. So basically what I do to align mine is I line that little dot that says Polaris. Oh, if I can get it on the screen again. There we go. That little dot that says Polaris with the North Star. So the North Star is not perfectly north. It is slightly offset, and that's why that Polaris exists on that little circle. And so what I would do is I would actually loosen my other axis, and I would actually turn my whole telescope here to basically line up the rough position of the constellations. So you can see as I'm rotating it here, sorry, this is a little tricky to get an angle, but as I rotate it, the constellations rotate. Ooh, this is very professional. So anyway, I would just rotate it to get where the constellations where they roughly are, and then I would move move those little knobs I was moving earlier, left and right, to basically line up Polaris with that dot. If I have to move my telescope axis up and down, I also have a set of levers here that if I loosen one of them and tighten the other, I haven't moved them in a long time, then the whole mount actually goes sort of up and down. The reason I don't move this very much is because I usually stay at the same latitude. I stay stargazing in the Kansas City area. All right, so that's a little complicated, and like I said, most of you won't be dealing with that alignment setup. 1 second. All right, there we go. Okay, so once we've gotten our telescope as close to north aligned as possible, we will be pretty much ready to observe, which is pretty exciting. The last thing we'll need to do, though, is we will need to align our spotting scope. And to do that, I would pick something really bright and easy to find. If the moon is up, use the moon. If not, use a really bright star or a planet. But what you'll do basically is you'll find something in the sky using the main eyepiece here. And remember, you'll have to adjust the focus, which is with these knobs right next to the eyepiece. If you wear glasses, you'll never have to wear them with a telescope. You'll want to get your eye as close to the eyepiece as possible, just because your field of view will be much wider and it'll be easier to see through the eyepiece. You can always adjust the focal, the focus of your telescope. So even if you have bad eyesight, you can always adjust that. So you'll want to get that nice and focused, and you'll want to point it, close to the moon. So we'll point it at where the moon is, and we'll lock it in place here. And then so after we lock it in place, we'll want to zero in on the moon. So you're doing this by hand first. So as you're moving the telescope around, after you've unlocked the axes here, you'll point it at something, and you'll kind of want to, look through the eyepiece as you're moving it around. As you can see, the eyepiece is kind of at a weird angle sometimes. And to adjust that, we'll just loosen these screws on the tube clamps here, and then I can just rotate the entire tube. In this case, I'll rotate it like 90 degrees, keeping it in roughly the same position to maintain that balance, and then retighten it. And now the eyepiece is in a much better angle, so I can look through there. I can point it mostly at the moon. Now, after I've pointed it close to the moon, I'll tighten these levers here. But I'll want to kind of get it perfectly lined up with the moon, right? And to do that, we're going to use these adjustment knobs. So near those levers, you'll also have a couple knobs, and these knobs will let you manually fine-tune your telescope's position. So as I turn this knob, you can see my telescope is moving slowly along that axis. And then if I turn this other knob back here, it's moving slowly along the other axis. It's kind of like Etch-a-Sketch. So you're going to look through your eyepiece, before you look through your eyepiece, you're going to put both hands on those knobs so you can find them. And you're going to look through your eyepiece, and then you're going to Etch-a-Sketch back and forth until the moon is right in the center of your field of view. And when it's right in the center of your eyepiece, after you've Etch-a-Sketched to it, then we will line up our spotting scope. That's what these little screws are on the top here. Inside the spotting scope, at the risk of messing with our here, inside the spotting scope is actually a little crosshair. So that crosshair will likely be a little off from the moon. So what you'll do is you'll want to turn this screw. So I'm turning the screw, and you can see my crosshair is moving. You'll want to turn the screw until the crosshair is pointing right at the moon. And when it's pointing right at the moon, then we know both the spotting scope and our telescope are pointing at the same point. I hope that kind of makes sense. So once you've aligned our spotting scope, then we know that it's pointing in the same place that the rest of the telescope is pointing. They are aligned to each other, and now we can use the spotting scope to find things. So if I wanted to find something smaller like a planet, then this time what I'll do is I'll look through the spotting scope first, and I'll use the spotting scope to line it up with something. And then once the spotting scope is pointed at that object and I tighten these levers, then I know that when I look through the main eyepiece, I'll also be looking at that object. And so that's what the spotting scope's for. That will help us make it a lot easier to find those distant objects. Now, a couple other things about telescopes. Remember that the smaller the eyepiece, the more zoomed in you'll be, but at the cost of your field of view. There are fancy eyepieces that are more expensive, that use multiple lenses to give you a wider field of view for a more zoomed image. And I've got one that I use for planetary observing. This one right here. So this is no, that's not the one I wanted. Oh yeah, it's in here. So this right here is a 5mm eyepiece. Now I've got, I took out my sort of beginner 6.3mm eyepiece, and remember the field of view is super tiny. It's gonna be really hard to get your eyeball in there to find those objects. But this is a 5mm eyepiece, so you would think the field of view would be even smaller,
but its field of view is actually really wide. But as you can see, it's a lot bigger, so there are a lot more lenses in here to help with that. And this is a more expensive thing, but this is great for looking at planets because we'll want to be really zoomed in for planets, but we want a wider field of view so we can see a little better. There's another thing you can get if you don't want to spend the extra cash on one of these fancier lenses. There's a great cheap option to boost your magnification, and that is something called a Barlow lens, or a Shorty Barlow lens is the most common one you'll see. And this is an adapter that by itself is not anything fancy. There's really nothing inside of it except for one lens. And this is just a doubler, basically. So whatever eyepiece you put in here, it doubles the magnification. Now this does use another lens, so you're going to lose a little bit of light. So things are going to be a little bit dimmer and maybe a little bit blurrier. But if you were, say, looking at a planet and you had a 17mm eyepiece, which had a nice wide field of view, and you wanted to get double the magnification without going to that really tiny field of view, what you would do is you would take that intermediate eyepiece and you would slide it into the Barlow first, tighten that up, and then the Barlow lens would slide into the eyepiece holder, and then you would have double the magnification. All right. Okay, it looks like I've got all your questions so far. That's awesome. Now, I mentioned before that mine is slightly fancier in that it is motorized. So another cool thing about telescopes and the modular approach is that depending on the type of mount you have, you may be able to add motors to it. So mine actually has motors added onto it, and I can actually attach a power source to it and with a remote. And what happens when I attach this, sorry, I'm getting used to this angle. When I attach this, this power source, maybe I'll just kind of casually hang out back here. When I attach this power source and attach that power source to this controller, I can do some fine control movements with these buttons, but also it will track. So what happens is, normally when you set your equatorial mount up and you align it and you get it all set up, and you find Saturn through your telescope, you put in that nice eyepiece and you look at it, but you'll notice it's kind of moving, right? Well, that's because your mount is not following the movement of the Earth. Now, the great thing about equatorial mounts is that once you have found an object, you don't really need a motor. All you need is one knob. And remember, I said there are two knobs on our equatorial telescopes. All you need to do to follow the motion of the Earth is turn the right ascension knob, okay? So when you're looking at Saturn through your telescope and you see it kind of move out of the field of view, if you've aligned it correctly, if you've polar aligned it and north aligned it and it's nice and level, all you should have to do is turn this knob, and your telescope is designed to follow the motion of the Earth. That's why this telescope is pointed all weirdly, and that's why the axes are all are in this configuration, because it's designed to follow the motion of the night sky. It's designed to follow the rotation of the Earth. Like I said, though, you can attach motors to that, and the motors can automatically follow whatever you're looking at. And that's very handy, especially for me when I do telescope viewing events where we do where I have a lot of people look through my telescope. Then I don't have to worry about continually adjusting. But again, the great thing about this equatorial mount telescope is that even when you do have to adjust to follow objects, it's designed so that you only have to turn one knob and you can basically just manually follow the motion of objects in the sky. So that is the awesome thing about these equatorial mounts. And that's why I would definitely recommend them regardless of what kind of tube you're using. An equatorial mount is really good because although it is a little bit more complicated and less intuitive at first, it is designed to make stargazing easier. After you learn a little bit about why and how it's working, then it's really beneficial and helpful to find those things in the sky. And ultimately, that's what you're wanting to do. You're wanting to locate objects in the sky, and this will help you do that more easily. So we are just about to our wrap-up point. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop those in there. And while we're waiting for those questions, I'll mention a couple other things. So this telescope will most often be used at nighttime, but there are opportunities to use in the daytime with the with the correct kind of filter. So what I have here is a solar filter, and it looks just like a mirror, but this filter actually lets in 1% of the sun's light. So what this is designed to do is that I can put it on the end of my telescope, and now suddenly my telescope can look at the sun. So I can point this at the sun now, and I can look at the sun in visible light. And if the sun was at a better angle, I would actually try to do that through my window, but I can't quite get the right angle on that. So I can use this telescope in the daytime. You never, ever, 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 ever want to point your telescope at the sun without this filter on, because your telescope is designed to focus light, and the sun is giving off a lot of light. But with this filter on, you'll be able to see you'll be able to see sunspots on it if there are any. Right now the sun is in a period of less activity, so there aren't a whole lot of sunspots or features on the sun to see at the moment. But this filter will let you look at the sun when it is more active. Another useful item is there are a couple eyepiece filters that you can get that will help you to filter light out. There are some eyepiece filters that are designed to be used for planet observing, but I don't really recommend those for beginners. There is one that is very useful though, and mine comes in 2 parts. And this is an adjustable polarized filter. So what I do is I guess you don't need to see my face. So there are 2 parts here, and these 2 parts screw together. Got it backwards. And when they screw together, this actually becomes an adjustable polarizing filter. So you can see here, as I rotate it, it becomes sort of like a dark pair of sunglasses. So I use this most often for looking at the moon, because when you're looking at a gibbous moon or a full moon, it's going to be really, really bright. And you're going to want to filter some of that light out. Otherwise, you're just going to be blinded. And the moon is really bright when that light is focused in a telescope. So what I'll do is I'll adjust that to a certain point, and then I'll attach it to my eyepiece, whichever eyepiece I'm using to look at the moon. And this is another counterintuitive thing about eyepieces, but filters actually screw on the bottom of eyepieces. So I've got the top of the eyepiece here and the bottom that goes into the tube. So this actually screws onto the bottom of the eyepiece. And then again, counterintuitively, here, I'll just do this. The whole thing, filter first, actually just slides straight in there. So the filter is actually way there on the inside of the eyepiece holder. Again, a little counterintuitive, but that is how telescopes are designed to work, how eyepieces are designed to work. There are a couple other things. If you do have a reflecting telescope, the eyepiece will be at the bottom, and that can make things kind of tricky because you'll need to be like bending way down and over to look through it. And most of those telescopes either come with, or it's recommended that you use a diagonal. And a diagonal is basically just a mirror that will bend the light. So it'll be a sort of a 45-degree angle mirror, so that your eyepiece will go in at an angle. So you look down, and the mirror bounces the light, and then it angles towards the tube. I don't have a diagonal because reflecting telescopes don't need those. I could use one, I suppose, to help sort of with this angle, but you do lose a little bit of light when that extra step of reflection happens. There are a couple other things. This little adapter here actually attaches onto the eyepiece, and it'll help you to align a smartphone camera. So this makes it a little easier to take pictures of things through the telescope eyepiece. And yeah, so I'm trying to think if there's anything I missed. That is really the basics of setting up our equatorial telescope. Taking it down will just basically be the same process exactly in reverse. I always make sure to put my tube cap on. I also make sure to bring, here, rotate this again. I also make sure to bring my focus thing all the way back in, because you can see you can telescope this way out, and this is now sticking out. It could get caught on something, so I'll bring it all the way back in. I've got another cap that will plug up the eyepiece spot, and I'll tighten these set screws to hold that cap on. So now all the open spots of my telescope are plugged up. Then we'll basically just do the process in reverse. But we are getting to the end of our allotted time, so I won't spend time doing that on our stream. And it seems like we've gotten all the questions that have come through. If we did miss any questions, we will be sure to write those down and bring them up on Friday. Remember, Friday at 6 p.m. we will be doing our Fan Friday live stream where I'm going to answer all your questions live. And we will go from there. So thank you all so much for joining me on this telescope live stream. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope you've enjoyed this view of the wall of my apartment. I'm just gonna, we got one last question here from Sheila. How do we do this in the dark? That is actually a really good question. And I've got something. So, obviously you want to use a light, but you don't want to use just any old flashlight because that light will ruin your night vision, and it takes about 5 minutes for your eyes to adjust to darkness. So what I would recommend doing is I would recommend getting a red light. So you can buy very cheap red LEDs on Amazon. I've got this headlamp that has a couple settings of red light, and it also has a regular colored light on it too, but the default setting is red. And that red, basically red light activates your eyes, activates the portion of your eyes that are sensitive to darkness the least, so that it basically saves your night vision. There are red rooms for developing film. It's the same principle. So I'd recommend finding a red light, or you can even buy some cheap red filter to put over a regular flashlight. That works just as well. But you can use that light to help you set up. But that's a great question, Sheila. How would you do this in dark? It's kind of tricky. And most telescopes do come apart. You can't just kind of leave it all set up. I would recommend not leaving it all set up because that can put stress on different parts of the telescope, and it makes it easier to bump that mirror portion. Remember, the bottom here is the most delicate part. We don't want to mess with that mirror alignment, or else it'll mess the alignment of the whole telescope up. Yeah, that about does it. And I think that was our last question. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm going to sign off with my head in the frame. Thanks so much for joining me on this live stream, everyone. Remember to check out those auctions on the Union Station Facebook page if you'd like to support Union Station, and tune in on Friday for our live stream. Yep, that concludes our stream. How about one last cameo from my parrot, Helen. If you don't like birds, you can tune out now, but she wants to say hi to everybody. So let's sign off with a view of Helen. Say bye, everybody. Bye, Helen. She's very excited and very thankful that you all joined me on this stream. And I will magically return here. This has been Patrick Hess, your planetarium specialist, signing off on another live stream. Thanks for coming, everyone. Bye-bye.